Good morning, everybody. I see a few people are still joining, but I think we'll get going. My name's Helen Russell, and I'm head of the Social Research Division here at the ESRI, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this morning's webinar on school absence, which will present the results from a new study by my colleagues Emer Smith, Anna Moya, and America Darmody. So congratulations to the three authors. The research is the first report in a new multi-annual research programme with TUSLA Education Support Service. And there will be a second report in the coming weeks for an in-person event for that report. So we'll keep you posted on that. We have had previous valuable research collaborations with TUSLA, such as last year's evaluation of the school completion programme. And I'd like to thank TUSLA on behalf of the ESRI for their continued support for this important research. So the format for this morning is that we'll first hear from Anya O'Keefe, who's Director of TUSLA Education Support Service. We'll then have a presentation of the research findings by Anna Moya and Emer Smith. We are also then very pleased to have a policy response from Dermot Moylan from the Social Inclusion Unit of the Department of Education. So thank you, Dermot, for participating today. And then there will be time for questions and answers from the audience and with the panel. So I'd ask you as we go along to please enter your questions into the Q&A function. So first I'm going to hand over to Anya O'Keefe who is the Director of the TUSLA Education and Support Service to say a few words. Thanks, Anya.
Thank you, Helen. Good morning, everyone, and a massive thank you to Helen and all of our colleagues in ESRI. Delighted to be here today to launch this report, very important report. And in reflecting on coming on this morning, I was thinking about what brought us into this partnership with ESRI, and that was our keen awareness in TUSLA Education Support Service in 2023, that as we saw in our annual attendance report and student absence report, as we saw the post-COVID versions go to publication, we were seeing that we had what has turned out to be an enduring pattern of problematic non-attendance post-COVID. And it was incumbent upon us as a service to pull together a 5-year plan for school attendance that has been our North Star in terms of thinking about how do we rearrange or focus in more or less on different pieces of the work that we do. And a big part of that for me was to think about what is our data. What is our data telling us? Is our data good enough? And then arising for that, how can we improve that data through systems that support us to be able to interrogate that data in real time and to be able to design services that are responding to needs on the ground that are based on what's currently going on and not what happened a number of years ago. So I suppose the data relationship with ERSI has been a real cornerstone of our 5-year plan. Our partnership will run throughout the 5-year plan, and today is very exciting in that it's the first, but as Helen has already announced, it's the first of many, the next one coming up in the coming weeks. And I think what that will do is make us all much wiser about what's happening with regard to school attendance. It will enable us to, as I've said, improve the systems through which we gather our information about school attendance. But for me, as director of a service that responds to those issues and challenges at front line, I know across our school completion programme, our homeschool community liaison colleagues and our educational welfare officers, the information and the wisdom we get through our reports with ESRI will improve how we design our services that will be more impactful for children and young people, their families and their schools and their school communities. So This is, as I've said, the first of many. I in particular want to thank Emer Smith and her colleagues Mirka and Anna for always working with us hand in hand, and for just being such great colleagues in order to get this work done. I also want to in particular thank the Department of Education and Youth for their ongoing support for TESS to interrogate what's happening in this space, and for their investment in us as a service so that we have been able to appropriately respond and continue to respond to emerging needs, particularly through our Shaw intervention with regard to school attendance that's being scaled to an additional 150 schools this month. And that, as people may be aware, we intend to roll out over the next 2 years throughout the rest of the lifetime of our 5-year plan that runs to 2028, to have that model scaled to all approximate 4,000 schools in that time period. And again, our partnership with the ESRI will be really key in terms of reviewing that and evaluating that intervention and helping us develop and tweak that intervention to ensure that children are attending school every day that the school is open, and supporting families and communities with how we can best do that. And finally, before I go, I'll also thank Dermot Moylan, our colleague from the Department of Education, who's going to give his great response today to what we hear. So Helen, thank you, and looking forward to hearing the presentations this morning.
Thank you very much, Anya. So now we have a presentation by the authors. So Anna is going to start off, I believe. So if you want to share your slides, Anna. Okay, we can see those. Thank you.
Yeah, just checking that you can see me correctly.
Yes, we can see and hear you now, Anna, as well. So over to you.
Okay. So without further delay, we'll begin the presentation, which our research is called School Level Patterns of Non-Attendance 2022-2023 and 2023-2024. And just to give a quick overview of the presentation, we're going to begin by giving an introduction, and then we'll consider the methodology that we followed, considering the data cleaning steps that we undertook, as well as the statistical methods that we chose. We will consider the main findings, and then we'll finalize by the conclusions, considering as well the limitations of our research and the main policy and practice implications. But first of all, we should spend just 1 minute to think why we should pay attention to school non-attendance. And also just to clarify that by school non-attendance, we mean what is commonly understood as absenteeism, but we follow research that uses this term rather than absenteeism, because this word is better for placing at the center the need for positive attendance, for showing up rather than the lack thereof. And going back to why we should care about school non-attendance, so there's been a series of research documenting that the pandemic has left long-standing disruptions on school attendance, and this has become the topic of international concern, both from policy as well as from the scholarly world, and we aim to contribute to this concern in the case of Ireland. And then we should care about school non-attendance because there's an extensive body of research that makes a very convincing case that school non-attendance has links with school performance, including, for instance, test scores. And not only that, but there is also growing research that is showing that the consequences of attendance extend beyond the immediate short-term consequences to also include long-term consequences, including educational and labor market outcomes. So for instance, in this sense, attendance has been linked to lower chances of high school graduation as well as university enrollment. And the report that we will take out in a few weeks will actually consider these long-term outcomes. We use data from the annual attendance report, which is collected by TUSLA Education Support Service, and these are administrative school records that all schools have to record and submit. And following this data set, we consider attendance by two main outcomes. The first one is the share of students with chronic absenteeism, which we can call the chronic absenteeism rate. And just to clarify, by chronic absenteeism, we mean students who are missing 20 or more days during a given school year. And then we also consider the days lost per student in a given year, so the counts of the total days lost. We consider the 2022, 2023, and then the 2023, 2024 data, but in this presentation, I'm going to focus on the most recent data. And in this presentation, we will also focus on the share of students with chronic absenteeism. And so there's two main research that guides our research. The first one is how are the two outcomes distributed across a group of schools? In other words, which type of schools are struggling the most with attendance? And the second question, is how do these outcomes differ between the two groups, and does it vary across school subgroups? In other words, what has happened between these 2 years, and which schools are still maybe not recovering as best as others. So moving on to the methodology, we are able to match these administrative school records to publicly available information that the Department of Education and Youth provides, and this allows us to access a wide range of school variables, including ethos, school size, gender mix, language of instruction, the school geographical coordinates, special school status, as well as fee-paying status. And so we process also the school coordinates, the geographical coordinates, through geospatial software that allows us to extract the area level of deprivation where schools are located. And to do so, we use an area level deprivation indicator that is called the POVAL index. Before considering the findings, it is important to also mention that this data presented several issues that needed to be addressed before doing the analysis. And amongst others, we had multiple cases of the duplicate school ID entries, so schools submitting their attendance records more than once. We also had cases of inconsistencies, for instance, schools submitting a number of students as chronic absentees that exceeds the total student population. We also had some matching difficulties due to school closures or school amalgamations that were just not properly updated to then link with the Department of Education data. And so considering all of these issues, we also thought that it was important to spend some time trying to identify and potentially drop as well observations that seem implausible, that seem extreme. And another issue as well with the methodology is the response rate. So we found that a quarter of schools, both at the primary and at the post-primary level, did not submit their records. And this is problematic because it speaks to issues of representativeness and generalizability of our data. We also consider the hypothesis that maybe these missing responses were concentrated around certain school characteristics, and we did not find overall this to be the case, but there are some exceptions. For instance, at the primary level, day schools and special schools have a much higher missing response than non-day schools. Specifically, special schools stand out with a particularly high rate of 45%, almost not submitting the records. And considering the data analysis, so for the 2023-2024 data, we do descriptive statistics with the 4 quantiles of the 2 outcome attendance variables. And in a minute, I'm just going to consider what do we mean by 4 quantiles. And then we also perform regression models. And then for the time comparison, we use 2 methods. So the first one is a method that looks at the absolute changes, so at the raw changes from one year to another one. And then we also look at relative changes. And by relative changes, we mean that we're taking into account the prior levels of absenteeism. So as we will see, there are certain types of schools that had a much higher level of baseline absenteeism. So this means that they have more room for improvement, more room for absolute changes. So it is important that we also look at the relative changes, because otherwise just looking at the absolute changes might be a little bit misleading. And delving into the findings, so this is primary 2023-2024, and this is by DAISH and special school status. Here, this graph refers to the chronic absenteeism rates. So this graph shows the distribution of quantiles. And by quantiles, what we mean is that we divided the total schools into 4 quantiles, depending on their levels of chronic absenteeism. So the first quantile refers to the top 25% of schools with the lowest chronic absenteeism. The lower middle quantile would be the following 25% of schools, with also the second to lowest chronic absenteeism rate. And then the high, and so on and so forth, until the highest, the fourth quantile, which is the 25% of schools with the highest chronic absenteeism rate. And this graph shows how are the quantiles distributed across types of schools. So for instance, the non-day schools, we see that 15% of non-day schools fall into the highest quantile of chronic absenteeism, whereas 30% of schools of non-day primary schools fall into the lowest quantile of chronic absenteeism. And this graph shows important differences by day status, with 87% of primary urban Band 1 schools falling into the worst quintile of absenteeism. Special schools also seem to fare particularly poorly, with 75% of special schools also falling into the worst quintile of chronic absenteeism. We see that Band 2 schools and rural schools also perform worse than non-day, though the differences are not as high. We can also look at school size, and we see in this graph that there is a little bit of a gradient where the smallest and the small schools seem to have somewhat of a better performance, measured by a higher share of the best quantile, of the lowest quantile, which is the one in the light blue, and a lower share of the worst quantile, which is the ones with the dark blue. The largest schools seem to be the ones that are doing the worst, with 35% of largest schools falling into this worst quintile of chronic absenteeism. And then here we have the graph by the area level of deprivation. So again, we also see a clear gradient here, with higher levels of deprivation being progressively associated with higher levels of the worst forms of chronic absenteeism. We see that more than half of the schools in disadvantaged areas belong to the worst quintile of chronic absenteeism, and this compares to only 16% of schools in affluent areas that fall into this quintile. We also see that almost 40% of schools in affluent areas fall into the lowest quintile of chronic absenteeism, compared to only 13% of schools in disadvantaged areas. And these are the findings from the regression model. So this doesn't come as a surprise because the differences in the graph were quite striking, but in the regression model, we get confirmation that day and special schools do have highly significant higher levels of chronic absenteeism, as well as days lost per student. More specifically, we find that in comparison with non-day schools, Band 1 urban schools report 17 percentage point higher share of chronic absenteeism, whereas special schools report on average 15 percentage points higher chronic absenteeism rate. We also consider ethos, and we find that multi-denominational schools have higher levels of absenteeism than Catholic ones. And this comes as a little bit of a surprise because multi-denominational schools, at least at the primary level, have a bit of a more advantaged profile than Catholic schools. But again, this data, we don't have access to social demographic information of the students, so it is a bit difficult to establish what is compositional and what is contextual. In regards to size, and again, this might not come as a surprise because we also saw the graph, we do see that smaller schools tend to perform a bit better than the large schools. But it is true here that it is important to consider that day schools are underrepresented in the small and smaller category, so there are less day schools that are small. But this model does control for days, which means that also days small schools have this advantage. So there might be something related to school size that has this positive effect on attendance. And one hypothesis could be related to perhaps greater social pressure, in the sense that in small schools, parents and teachers might know each other a bit better, and this might create a little bit of a social penalty for parents who take out their children from school, because there is a bit more of a context and these social relationships. And then we also find that in comparison with English medium schools, Irish medium schools at the primary level also have better attendance outcomes. And this can be related to the fact that they do have a more advantaged socioeconomic mix in their student body. But it could also be related to perhaps the fact that they might foster a greater sense of identity and community that might lead to greater engagement, both from parents and from children. We also see that higher levels of socioeconomic deprivation are associated with greater absenteeism, and this doesn't come as a surprise given the graphs. There is a little bit of an interaction terms where the absenteeism associated with being in a deprived area is less pronounced for urban Band 1 schools, which maybe the support associated with this type of schools offsets the area level deprivation. And then we don't find that gender mix or county are significant factors. So now, considering secondary schools, we find again important differences by day status, with 42% of schools of post-primary day schools falling into the worst quintile of chronic absenteeism, which compares to 15% of non-day schools. We also see, again, as in the primary level, a clear gradient with the area level deprivation, where more affluency of the area is associated with lower share of the worst quintile of absenteeism. And considering the findings of the regression model, as in the primary stage, in post-primary, we find that day schools have higher levels of both chronic absenteeism as well as days lost. And more specifically, day post-primary schools have 7 percentage points higher chronic absenteeism rate. We also find that fee-paying post-primary non-day schools also have better attendance outcomes, with these size effects being quite large. Here, the gender mix does appear to be a bit more meaningful, as we see that boys' schools are associated with lower counts of chronic absenteeism compared to mixed gender schools. But there's no differences by days lost, so differences in gender mix are rather limited. And here, in relation to ethos, we find that schools with minority ethos have better outcomes than the rest of the ethos, which might be related to the fact that these schools have a more advantaged socioeconomic mix of their student body. Just as in the primary level, we also find that in the post-primary level, Irish medium schools have better chronic attendance rates, which again could be related to perhaps this greater sense of community or a sense of involvement in Irish medium schools as opposed to English medium ones. And then we also find, like in the primary level, that higher levels of socioeconomic deprivation as measured by the Powell index are consistently and progressively associated with greater absenteeism, and this is over and above the effects of day status. Here, for the post-primary stage, we do not find school size to be a meaningful factor, and this could provide more support for the hypothesis that in the primary stage, small schools create some sort of social pressure, because in the post-primary stage, it is arguably the case that parents have less agency over whether they can over their children's school absenteeism. So that might explain why size is meaningful at the primary, but not meaningful at the post-primary. And we also find again that county, so geographical county, is not a meaningful factor. Testing interaction terms here does not yield important insights. So we find that overall the effects of being a day school, on attendance are consistent across the population of schools. And I leave it to Emer to continue.
Thank you, Anna, and good morning, everyone. So I'm going to talk a bit about the trends between 2022-23 and 23-24. So looking at the raw changes over time, we divided it between three groups of schools. Schools that experienced a large increase in attendance, so their attendance dropped by more than 6.8%, and then there's a group that had a smaller drop in attendance. But even though we see on average attendance improved slightly between the 2 years, there's a significant minority of schools that 3 in 10 schools that actually saw an increase in their attendance. So most schools saw an improvement, but a modest improvement, while some schools worked in the opposite direction. Next slide, please. So this just shows you how this varies across type of school, showing DESH status and showing special schools as well. We see that the largest decreases were evident in the DESH sector, but we also see a significant group had a disimprovement in attendance. And this was particularly the case for special schools, where 4 in 10 saw an increase in chronic absence rates between the 2 years. Next slide, please. We also see that we get greater reductions in attendance problems in disadvantaged and below average areas, but very little variation in the kind of those who had poorer attendance. So that was quite common across the different kinds of areas. Next, please. So Anna had talked about the important distinction between looking at absolute changes and relative changes. A school that has a very high initial level of chronic absence can demonstrate quite a large relative drop from year to year. So if you start off at 35% of your students being chronically absent, it's easier to get a 6 percentage point reduction in that compared to a school that starts at 8% chronic absence. So here we present both the absolute changes and the relative changes to give a clearer picture of what's going on. So if we take account of school characteristics, size, gender mix, and DESH status, and so on, we see a small reduction of 3.2 percentage points between 23 and 24 in chronic absence. And the equivalent for days lost is a reduction of an average of 1 fewer days lost per student. These changes tend to be pretty consistent across school types, though we do see a little bit more of a marginal improvement in urban band 1 DESH schools and schools in deprived areas. Now, when we move on to look at relative changes, the picture becomes a bit more nuanced. So if we compare schools that had the same levels of absenteeism in 2023, we actually see that DESH schools and special schools showed higher rates of chronic absenteeism and days lost in the following year. The gap was over 7% for special schools and almost 6% for urban band 1 schools. We see a slight improvement for mixed gender as opposed to single sex schools. And we see that smaller primary schools kind of really compound their advantage that we saw from the cross-sectional picture. We also see that schools in more socioeconomically advantaged areas show a better trend over time than schools in disadvantaged areas. Now, when we move on to post-primary level, we did the same exercise. So we divided the schools into 3 groups. Here, a large decrease translated into more than 5.5% of a reduction. Again, we see most schools have experienced a decrease in their absence levels, chronic absence, but mostly small. But we see a very significant group, 4 in 10, are actually increasing attendance problems, and this is higher than at primary level. Now, when we compare DESH and non-DESH schools, we can see DESH schools are somewhat more likely to have a larger decrease, but the differences aren't as great as they are at primary level. Similarly, when we look at the Pobl Index of local area deprivation, we can see that we're seeing more of an increase in disadvantaged areas and areas that are marginally below average compared to more affluent areas. Now, when we model these, we looked again at absolute changes and then at relative changes. So for post-primary schools, controlling for their characteristics, we see a slight drop of 1.7 percentage points in the rate of chronic absence, and that's less than we find for the primary sector. That translates into 0.7 of a day, fewer days lost per student. And this reduction tends to be broadly consistent across schools when we take account of school characteristics. Again, when we look at relative changes, we see that given their starting point, that DEIS schools have a higher rate of chronic absence and more days lost per student than non-DEIS schools. We see that schools in more advantaged areas, more affluent areas, are doing slightly better, but only for days lost rather than chronic absence per se. So the affluent areas are kind of have 4 fewer days lost per student. And otherwise, we see that these relative changes are pretty consistent across school ethos and across the gender mix of the school. So just to conclude and try and draw together some of what we've been pointing out, I mean, I think the most striking finding is that we're seeing that non-attendance is more pronounced in schools serving disadvantaged communities, and these schools aren't recovering as well as others post-pandemic. Now, given that the further research we're going to have coming out soon, we know that poor attendance links to poor attainment and poor adult outcomes. So these patterns are in effect going to act as a source of the production and reproduction of socioeconomic inequalities. At the same time, we have to caveat the limitations of the work we can present here. We're talking about school level. We don't have information on students' socio-demographic characteristics. So we can't determine whether the differences we find are compositional or contextual. So in other words, we don't know if the DEIS patterns are due to the kind of prevalence of disadvantaged students in those schools, or if there's an additional effect from the concentration of disadvantage in those schools. And as Anna pointed out, we see much lower rates of return of school records post-pandemic than before. Non-response tended to be less than 10%, or even closer to 5% in the period before the pandemic, but now it's around a quarter. So in terms of the implications then of our findings for practice and policy, for data, we see that if there were validation systems built into data entry, it would improve quality. There does seem to be a need to kind of try and encourage schools to submit returns. And a lot could be done if we could link these data to student level data from the department's pod or PPOD, and therefore we could really unpack the relative role of student and school level in driving non-attendance. Now, in terms of policy implications, we know from international research that multi-tiered interventions, which involve a multidisciplinary team and they promote interaction between children, parents and schools, are more successful in promoting attendance. And these are particularly successful if they address the reason or reasons underlying school absence and tailor the intervention accordingly. Now, this approach, as Anya mentioned, is being currently implemented through the An Seo pilot programme. There's also a need for further research on absence in special schools. We see high rates of absence, but we can't fully disentangle whether these are due to illness or absence for medical or therapeutic appointments. There's currently a pilot programme on in-school therapy provision for special schools. So monitoring that would be really important in giving us insights into what factors are at play. But finally, schools can make a difference, but they may be limited in their ability to address some of the financial, social and emotional difficulties among families that contribute to school absence. So we need to kind of place school interventions in the broader policy context, looking at the barriers, addressing the barriers caused by child poverty, by mental health difficulties among children, teenagers and their parents, and among broader issues in the community like addiction and crime. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Emer and Anna, for an excellent presentation. That was really clear. I'm sure those of you listening will have lots of questions and comments. So please put them into the Q&A and we'll be able to come to those after the after our discussant. So I'm very happy now to welcome Dermot Moylan from the Social Inclusion Unit at the Department of Education. So Dermot will give us a response to the findings. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Helen, and good morning, everybody. I'm just going to share a couple of slides with the group, if I may. Yes. I suppose to start with, education welfare functions returned to the Minister for Education and Youth on the 1st of January of 2021, which was a mere 9 months after the start of the COVID-19 pandemic. And the functions, education welfare functions transferred include TUSLA Education Support Services, or TESS as we commonly know and use the phrase. For anyone not familiar with TESS, the service has 3 distinct different strands: the Statutory Educational Welfare Service, and 2 support school services, the HSEL programme and the School Completion Programme under the General DESH programme. The EWS is a statutory service, and its legal underpinning and functions are outlined in the Education Welfare Act of 2000. And the primary role of the EWS is to ensure that every child either attends school regularly or receives a certain minimum education, and is to ensure and secure every child's entitlement to education. Now, the slide you're currently looking at there outlines some figures for the last 6 years. So I suppose the question asks, why has the department made school attendance a priority? The data tells us that school attendance has become a bigger issue since the pandemic. The department engages with schools in relation to a number of issues, and schools also have their own set of circumstances and problems. In relation to the data in the slide is compiled from the annual attendance return, which is submitted each year by schools to TUSLA. The data in detail is there and further available on the TUSLA website. But to pick up on a couple of points, if you look at 11% of primary students missed 20 plus school days in the 2018-2019 school year, and that increased to 21%, 20 plus school days in the 23-24 school year. And there's been a comparable increase on post-primary also. Now, all of this data is contained on the TUSLA website as they publish each and every report. If we look at referrals for the EWS, in referrals for the EWS in Q4 of 2019, they had 1,419. In Q4 of 2024, there was 2,706. So an increase of over 1,200. Next slide, please, Brian, if you could. So the department's policy response to tackling school attendance. In relation to school returns, and this was also referenced by Emer in her presentation, in 2018-2019 school year on primary schools, we had 89.5% returns compared to 76.3% in the 23-24 school year. I suppose if all schools submit the annual attendance return, we would have complete 100% data on the extent of school attendance and the issues that pertain. In 2025, a communication issued from the department to all schools, reminding schools of the importance of submitting their annual attendance return, and also, where applicable, to follow on is the student absence return. So the department would be looking to issue something similar to schools in 2026 to increase the level of returns. On the issue of funding, the Education Welfare Services came back to the department in 2021. The department has increased its funding to these services each and every year. This in turn has allowed TESS, for example, to employ additional education welfare officers and other staff to ensure that any referrals received are screened and allocated, cases resolved as soon as possible, and waiting line lists and waiting times are reduced. By comparison, in 2026, the total allocation to TESS is in the region of €60 million. At the time of transfer of functions of the Education Welfare Services to the department in January 21, the allocation to TESS was slightly over €34 million. The number of EWOs has increased significantly since 2021, when there were 90 full-time posts. Currently, across TUSLA's 6 regions, there are 154 EWOs, and 5 temporary EWOs. And they're working across 21 teams led by a senior education welfare officer. Included in the figures of 154 EWOs and 23 senior EWOs, services are provided to the most vulnerable children and young people, such as children in care, children living in homeless education, children seeking international protection, and children missing in education. Next thing then will be the school attendance grant from 2023 and 25. The TUSLA's 5-year school attendance campaign, which was mentioned earlier by Anya, is to promote the attendance of school, and it was launched early in the 2023-24 school year. It is timely as we have as a country emerged from the COVID period. More than ever before, the department is aware of the importance of regular school attendance for our children and young people, its impact on their social development and their well-being, and particularly in ensuring that they connect with their classmates and others, wider staff in the school community. In tandem with the launch of the campaign, a funding package of over 6 million was secured to support and promote attendance in primary, post-primary and special schools. And this was announced by the Minister at the time. And the funding issued to all schools in October of 2023. The grant given to schools had 2 distinct separate focuses. One was aimed to enhance regular school attendance and also targeting individuals and groups at higher risk of educational disadvantage due to poor attendance. Schools were given flexibility to use the grant within the school year or to spread it out over a number of school years as they saw fit. They were to align it with their school self-evaluation report, their improvement plan, or if they were in the DESH program, their DESH action plan for improvement. The plans that they could come up with would involve early year settings, primary schools, post-primary schools working together to address issues related to attendance, especially among children and young people at risk of educational disadvantage. They could also use a portion of the grant for school activities, drama, music, educational and cultural school trips. The department most recently has issued a further attendance grant to school that issued in December 25, just gone by, and we included in guidance documents which will issue to schools shortly in the coming days, if not this week, successful initiatives and examples of best practice across schools to further improve what schools will take on. The next issue is the Education Welfare Act of 2000, which, as I said earlier, underpins legislatively TUSLA and the Education Welfare Service. The department and the ministers committed to process an amendment to this act to bring all students attending school under the realms of the act once they are enrolled and registered in a school. So this will mean that if a child is under the age of 6, is registered in the school, and if there is a school attendance issue, the school will be able to make a formal referral to the Education Welfare Service, and an Education Welfare Officer can engage with parents and guardians. School attendance issues can be identified and addressed far earlier. Anseo is as Anya mentioned also earlier, is a new evidence-based, multidisciplinary, multi-tiered system of supports, which will help schools analyse and respond to attendance data. It was successfully piloted in 4 schools in 2023-24, and we have now extended it out to 60 further schools in this current school year. There is a dedicated team in TESS working with these 60 schools, promoting and supporting the implementation of the model, and this will help schools to develop effective and appropriate strategies to respond to the issues and drivers of school absenteeism. Funding has been secured through dormant accounts to offer Anseo to additional schools in 2026, and we expect a further 150 schools will be offered the Anseo programme in this quarter of 26. And the model is due then to be scaled to all schools at the start of the next school year. The second last matter is the multimedia campaign. A multimedia campaign was launched last September. I hope there's many people on the call today who would have come across the campaign. The aim of the campaign was to get parents and guardians of children of children who take them out of school for reasons other than being fully unwell, by positively communicating the importance and benefits of regular daily school attendance. The campaign was developed by TESS and the department over a number of months, and consultation was had with school management bodies, the National Parents Council, the HSC and Child Public Health. And there are options for a further media campaign later on in the year currently being explored with TESS. In tandem with the launch of the school attendance campaign, a school attendance webpage on the gov.ie hosting platform was developed, and this signposts to parents and to schools where they can find practical advice and support around school attendance. Next slide there, Brian, please. And then just to finish out, there are some of the many policy responses from the department to tackle school attendance. The school attendance campaign we expect to run until at least 2028. And just to re-emphasize and commit that the department will continue to work with TESS over the next few years and identify any further initiatives to support regular and ongoing school attendance. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dermot. That was an excellent overview of all the policy initiatives in the space. And I think you make the important point there about, the importance of school attendance, not only for the educational outcomes, but for students' social development and well-being, and how the pandemic really underlined that for all of us in a way. I mean, I'm sure we were. The people in this room were aware of it beforehand, but I think that it really highlighted it in a very impactful way. So now we are joined by all the authors of the report to the panel. So we have America Darmody joining us as well, and Anya O'Keefe is back as well. So if you have questions on any of the content, please write them in there to the Q&A, and we will get to as many of them as we can. So maybe I will just start off on some that have already come in. So Nessun Vaughan, an old friend of the ESRI, I see, is asking about, he said some previous ESRI research has shown the power of positive student-teacher relationships in relation to school, education progression. And do you know if there's a correlation with those relationships and school attendance?
Maybe if I jump in. So yet another report that we're doing with TESS is based on Growing Up in Ireland data, and we look at trajectories of attendance between the ages of 9 and 13. And we find that transition difficulties from primary to post-primary and having more negative interaction with teachers, being reprimanded or given out to, are associated with maintaining or even increasing levels of school absence. So it is a factor. And we also see an indirect effect through school engagement. So those young people who have more negative interactions with teachers and less positive reinforcement tend to be more negative about school. And we find that being more negative about school is a stronger driver of attendance difficulties post-pandemic than it was previously.
Thank you very much, Emer. There are a few questions here around the reporting. So you showed, that there was quite a high rate of non-reports there at the primary school level. So there's one question here about whether is that reporting of absentee data to TUSLA or to the Department of Education and Youth, or are they both the same thing?
I might come in there, Helen. So just to clarify, all reporting for absenteeism is to TUSLA, to the Educational Welfare Service under the Education Welfare Act 2000. So we gather all of that data, not the Department of Education. in terms of the non-reporting. Schools are busy, busy places, and what we are learning through the engagement with schools to encourage greater reporting. It is a requirement to report, but what we really want to do, and the Minister had given us the go-ahead last year to begin to scope for a better system for doing that. So like anything, we want to get the best out of what we can make really, really easy. So rather than principals and busy school secretaries needing to compile reports to get into us, we would like to be able to go into their systems and take that data. For this, I'm not a data person. It's the simple way I can explain that with all of the required safety, data protection safeties in place. So we want to make that reporting really streamlined, and that will also allow us to have real-time or as close to real-time data as possible, so that we're actually being really responsive in the moment, and as I said earlier, not a couple of years later. So I think what this report today for me also reminds us is that there are ways for us to make this easier, which will improve our data set, which will ensure that we are understanding the trends that we've seen today correctly, and with even greater confidence. Thanks, Helen.
Yes, so I suppose a follow-up to that is, do we know anything about the characteristics of schools that aren't reporting? Somebody's asking here about, do we know about the ethos of the schools that are reporting? I think you're suggesting that it's around perhaps IT resources or other, admin resources. So do we have a sense of what the barriers are? Is it smaller schools? Is it the schools in the DESH areas?
Emer might correct me, but my sense is it is across the board, with some DESH primaries particularly struggling. And again, if you think about maybe the different systems you might have available to you, perhaps in a bigger school, you have more of a possibility of having an online app that does that recording, and then maybe are resourced differently in terms of having that additional capacity to get it done. And again, I think it's about understanding what those challenges are, which we're working out with. There are third-party providers across the country, and not all, but the majority of schools have apps. The few that don't are probably primary. And it's about figuring out, how do we get that technology to assist us in this and make it really easy for people to do. Thanks, Helen.
Thank you. So maybe before we move on to some of the other questions substantively, there's a clarification, which is an important one. So someone's asking, can you explain the difference between absenteeism and days lost?
I can jump on that. So the first outcomes is chronic absenteeism share. So we look at the number of students who are registered as chronic absenteeism, which is students missing 20 days or more in a given school year. So we look at the percentage of these students against the total student population, and then the days lost just refers to the counts of the total days lost that a student has missed over the period of 1 year. So it is different, because one refers to the share of students who are registered as chronic absentees, and then the other one refers to the days lost. So say 15 days lost per average in a given school. And I also, just to clarify on the last question around the non-response rate, if someone is interested in this, it is on the appendix of a report. There's an analysis by all school characteristics. We consider if there are differences in the response rate by school characteristics. And on the topic of ethos at the primary level, we do see that there are a little bit of differences, with Catholic and minority faith schools having a little bit of a lower non-response rate than multi-denominational schools. And at the post-primary school, regarding ethos, we also see that multi-denominational schools show a lower rate of non-response, so a little bit of mixed findings at the primary than at the post-primary level regarding ethos. But everything is on the appendix, so yeah.
Thank you, Anna. And maybe we'll put the link to the report into the chat. It's on our website, so you can download it there for anyone who wants to go into more of the detail. Another question here, again, I suppose about recording absence. And saying that schools are experiencing, parents taking, allowing children to leave early or arrive late, and then should that be recorded as an absence or not?
I'll take that, Helen, if that's
Thank
helpful.
you, Anya,
So there are a number of hours for the primary and post-primary. Off the top of my head, I'm not going to say what they are because I'll get it wrong, but it is determined what constitutes the number of hours present that makes up a school day. So that might be helpful, and I think principals would be aware of that. Also, on the third-party provider apps that schools use, parents, both at primary and post-primary, are required to enter when a child will be late or will leave early and what the reason for that is. And I think through our work with Anseo, it's understanding those patterns, because you do record that on your software at school level or in your Rulla, if that's what you're still using in hard copy. And you can, analyze those patterns and have engagements either individually with parents and families, or more broadly, if you're seeing a trend across your school around what might be driving that. And we've seen some good examples through our work with Anseo to tackle some of the tweaks that can be made around different things that mightn't be obvious, but maybe drive some of that coming late, going early.
Thanks very much. Another question here about the attendance data and maybe the broader research as well. Probably considering your wider reading for Emer and the other authors. Does attendance research consider ethnicity and specifically Traveller and Roma students?
Unfortunately, without data linkage, we don't have that data for Ireland. It would be possible because Pod and Peapod do record Traveller Roma ethnicity, and if we could link those data, we could get greater insights. And unfortunately, to other data sources like Growing Up in Ireland, the numbers of travellers or Roma are too small to actually separate them out. So it is a gap in our knowledge at the moment.
Okay, and a question here from Sean Murphy about if the panel could give us some more information about the practical school supports that come with the Anseo campaign. Like, is there does that include psychological supports, and does it cover attendance, team meetings, and other issues? So yes, just a bit more detail on what the steps are there.
I'll take that one, Helen, in terms of the Anseo rollout. So to date, we've had 4 schools who completed a pilot. And then we went out to look for another 60 schools from September 2025 for this current school year to join at that stage. 590 schools looked to join, which was an incredible response. And we want to get to all of those schools as quickly as possible. And what we are looking at is our educational welfare officers on the Anseo team work with schools to understand the patterns of attendance and non-attendance using the school's data, and then to work with everyone at school level to think about what are the initiatives and interventions that can be put in place at school level and in the DEIS setting with the additional resources of homeschool and school completion programme that can be put in place in terms of tackling that attendance data. We are also connecting closely with our colleagues in NEPS, Inspectorate and NCHC with regard to what we find there. But unfortunately, I don't hold resource for psychological services or those sorts of approaches. But certainly where we identify what else that's beyond the remit of tests that could be put in place, we can make recommendations from a policy perspective back to our colleagues in the Department of Education. Thank you.
Thanks. And just following from that, Emer Evers here has asked whether the department, I suppose it's more for the department, has considered any health-related interventions such as clean air in classrooms, which has been found to be effective in other jurisdictions. I'm not sure if...
Suppose, Helen, I could come in, and it's not directly in my remit or my area, but I do recall and recollect there was grants paid out during the COVID period for purifiers or something to that effect, which obviously would have a benefit. I don't know, some schools may still be using them, for that benefit of the stuffy classroom, to use a phrase, I suppose, and the attention span and the interest peak of students. I know certainly that was done during COVID, but I suppose I can't definitively answer Emer's question on it, but I'm just aware of that. That's all.
Thank you.
Helen,
yes.
Could I also just come in and take the opportunity to flag we had a great partnership with Child Health Public Health as part of our attendance campaign, and you'll see on the website there is a jump box there to the health guidance from Child Health Public Health and HSE with regard to illness and a child being too sick for school, or when a child should be in school and can be in school. And I think as parents, it's great to get that really clear public health guidance with regard to attendance, because we know post-COVID that's been a challenge for people. So just to guide everyone to that page, because there's really good clear advice there. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, there are a few questions, I suppose, around the same issue around the reasons for non-attendance. Now, I know you said, Emer, that that there isn't a lot of detail in the actual attendance, school level attendance data, but I suppose there's an interesting question around, that social contract and what happened, post-COVID, that parents are perhaps more willing to allow students to stay at home. And I think your findings, I suppose, around smaller schools and maybe Irish language schools, that you were talking about, that there was more, you call it social pressure, but maybe it's that interpersonal relationship between the parents and the staff that enhances the attendance, and what lessons are there, or how can those be replicated, I suppose, in a bigger school, in a more urban environment. I don't know if the research, your own research or other research, talks to that.
Yeah, we definitely, in the other research we're doing on the trajectories of absence, see that that there is a difference between rural, very rural, so like open country or villages, and others in absence terms, which again tends to speak to that idea of the social cohesion and the role it plays. We're actually working on some of the student level data at the moment, and that there are reasons recorded for those who are chronically absent from school. So we see at primary that the dominant reason is illness, but we also see a very significant proportion have what are known as unexplained absences. And at primary level, about 10 to 12% are recording chronic absences due to holidays, which is higher than it was pre-COVID. At post-primary, actually, the biggest group is that unexplained group. So, I mean, as Anya said, there is, work to be done about finding a way of collecting this information in a more granular basis and a more accurate basis, just to get at what lies behind those reasons.
There is another question here around whether there was any insight from schools that have extracurricular activities, TUI experiences, non-academic programs, external visits by non-school staff to the school, and do those sort of interventions, I suppose, affect attendance? Again, I think we would be drawing on the wider research evidence base there, if there is any.
We certainly have
the authors, yeah.
We certainly have previous research that would show that extracurricular activities have a benefit for the cognitive and the non-cognitive development of children and young people. So, and in our work on the school completion programme funded by TESS, we saw that schools are, in many cases, actively trying to provide those activities to make school a more welcoming and enjoyable place for children and young people. But it's certainly something that we could look at a little bit more.
Mm-hmm.
But the only difficulty is then that those children with the worst attendance rates can often, not then come to those activities because they've been kind of left behind or left out, and it can be make it quite difficult then to break into those groups.
Okay. Sorry, and a question, Emer, about the sort of international comparisons. Are we do these figures that we have and non-attendance, do they look similar to what's happening in other countries, or was we know that in other countries there was different closures around the pandemic. Has the rupture been the same, or is there any pattern to those results?
It's difficult to get fully consistent data over countries, but there would seem to be roughly the same scale of chronic absence, which they count in the UK say is 10% or more. So, for example, figures for England and Scotland would show it's around that fifth, maybe slightly below that in the most recent data. So it does seem to be, it's not unique to Ireland. It's definitely been an issue, but I'm not aware of anything where you could actually look in a fine-grained way at whether the length of school closure made a difference.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. One for future research.
Exactly.
Helen,
yes.
Could I just come in there as well
yes.
to say Tess had worked on a project with the OECD and other member countries where which sort of led us to the research with ESRI in some respects that looked at the data, looked at the policy drivers, and looked at the practical interventions that are provided across a range of countries in the OECD membership. And the resounding piece we learned from that was that irrespective of the length of the closures, that countries are broadly impacted, as Emer said, in the same way. And I think it's important to note that there is some sense there that this isn't just about emerging from COVID. There was a trend with regard to attendance and attitudes to attendance that possibly predated that as well. And we need to be conscious of that, I think, in terms of not thinking that one thing caused this, but it was work that was ongoing before the pandemic. Thanks.
Yes, important point that there was that longer term trend. A question here, and again, maybe it's one for future research, but has there been any analysis done on the link between housing need and attendance? So looking at the impact of poor housing standards on health, the impact of overcrowding, and commutes, I suppose, that might be caused by changes in housing location. And they're mentioning here particularly people who are in IPAS residents where there is that change in housing location. So not something probably that you can do in the school level analysis, but maybe something that could be looked at in GUI research.
It could certainly be looked at in more detail. We do find for looking at the trajectories of non-attendance that housing tenure, so living in rented housing, either social housing or private rented, is associated with a risk in terms of poor attendance over and above other aspects of socioeconomic characteristics. So I think that's something that could be looked at in greater detail in the future.
Okay, I've an interesting comment here about parental responsibility. So this might be a good one for discussion about, that there's a lot of talk about, the school-based interventions and hot meals and of those sort of interventions. And some other countries have fines and penalties that are embedded into policies around attendance. I know in the UK is one example there, isn't it, where if parents were taking children out of school for holidays, there was penalties. So I don't know. Yes, if the panel would like to comment on the those sort of policies.
I'm happy to come in there, Helen.
Yeah.
And I think it's really important to say that under the legislation, it is a parent or parents that cause their child to attend schools. And when we do, which is a last resort, take proceedings, it is, of course, against the parents. Parents cause their children to attend school. It isn't a matter for the children. We have our fantastic homeschool community liaison team, 550 and counting, who are embedded across our DEIS schools and a small number of schools with high traveller enrolment. And the primary role there of the homeschool community liaison coordinator is to be out in the home, in the community, making that connection between the family and home. And that's really, really important. And, the emphasis, of course, in building that relationship is with regard to building capacity and removing barriers and bringing in whatever is needed to remove those barriers for regular school attendance. Our school completion programme colleagues then are working with the child to, again, figure out are there things that can be worked through to improve attendance. And then where needed, our educational welfare officers hold attendance clinics within school where we're seeing a concerning number of days and really needing to communicate with parents as that primary person enabling a child to be in school as to their obligations and what needs to happen. So parents, schools, our service are all a huge part, but with the focus on the parent. And I think that's really, really important. That's a big part of the work that's done.
Thank you, Anya. I've still got quite a few questions. I don't think we're going to get to them all, I'm afraid, but we will download them and pass them on to the authors. I might have a time for maybe one or two more. Sorry,
Helen,
Anya, did you want to?
I did.
Yeah.
Sorry, I did want to just address the more punitive measures as well, and to say the research would show that fines, etc., while popular, are not impactful, and if anything, disimprove the situation, which is interesting. It's very hard to find a point at which the fine outweighs some perceived gain, and can further damage relationships between school and home. So we have yet to find good evidence to say that we should be advocating for more punitive measures. I did just want to make that point, Ellen. Thank you.
Thank you. So maybe one of the final ones is around the transport issue. Again, and this maybe goes back to that point about the housing insecurity of people are moving away from schools. So it's from Michelle Meehan, is saying their school in a DEIS urban band 1 school that those transport costs are a big issue, and there's no school bus in place. So is that something that is coming up in the research?
I'm here on a research piece talking about what we do, but it is to say, and I think it's important for people to realise, should they need the support, we have educational welfare officers for children in IPAS settings, in homeless accommodation, and children in care, all of which have the same thing in common. Their accommodation could be very transitory, and supporting continuity in their education setting in their school is really, really important. It's such a protective factor. So those EWOs can help support and advise with regard to any of the barriers, including transport, that can be worked through to ensure that a child is in. And it is something that we are advocating with regard to, is, quick resolutions for children in an urban setting with regard to transport. It's really, really important. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So as I say, unfortunately, we're not going to get through the rest of the questions. We said we'd finish at 15:15. So thank you all very much for your engagement. Thank you very much to Anya and to Dermot for their contributions, and thank you very much to our 3 authors for an excellent report. And I hope to see the audience back again for the next piece of research in this really valuable collaboration. So thank you very much, everyone, for attending.